Let's start with component registration. We are registering our components with the component method on our app. And that's how we did it in all the past modules. Now, there is nothing wrong with this approach per se, but it's also not always the best way of registering components, because it turns out there is an alternative. Now, when we register components like this with the component method on our app, then we are registering those components as so-called global components. That means they're available globally in this entire Vue app. So we can use these components as custom HTML elements anywhere in this app, in the app.vue file, but also in any of our components here. So they're simply available anywhere in this root app. This is of course very useful because it means we can use these components as custom elements anywhere and we don't have to think about where to use them. But it also has one potential downside. These components of course all contain some code. Now, of course here they're all fairly simple components, but still it's a little bit of template code, a little bit of scripting code. Now, this code, of course, grows the bigger our application becomes. The more components we have, the more code packages we have, you could say. And if you're registering them all globally, that in the end means Vue needs to load them all when the application is loaded initially. So the browser needs to download the code for all those components initially. This is absolutely no problem for our basic application here, but for bigger applications it could be a problem. In addition, if you register everything globally here, this can be a very long list. If you have an application with, let's say, hundreds of components, this would be a super long list, and it would not be obvious where those components are getting used. If all these components are meant to be used in multiple places, or if maybe some of these components are only used in a few places. For example, the header. This component is really only used once. It's used here in app.vue. The same for user info. These are components which are just getting used once, and registering them globally therefore works, but is a bit redundant, you could say. We're just having these components so that we can outsource our code and keep our app.vue file lean, because that's the idea behind components. We want to build complex user interfaces by combining multiple building blocks. And that's why we also have another way of registering components. Despite registering them globally with this component method on our app, we can also register them locally in the component where we plan on using them. So for example, with the header, we could remove this component registration in main.js and remove this import here, and instead go to our app.vue file, which is where we plan on using this, and then here in the script section, we can import the header from components, the header.vue. And now we can also register this component locally in this app component or in this app object here, in this app options object. We do this by adding a new property here next to data, methods, computed, and all the other properties you learned about. And that would be the components property, which we haven't seen before, but here it is. And we can now tell Vue which components may be used in the template of this app here or of this component. And the components registered here are then really only usable here, not in any other child components, not anywhere else in our application, just here in this file, in this .vue file. Now components wants an object, and then we need a key value pair where the key is our custom HTML element. So the header, for example, the tag we want to use for this element, so to say. And then the value is the imported component config object we're pointing at. And if I do that and save this, this still all works, but now the header is registered locally. And you can actually also write this differently. This is perfectly fine, but you can also use the header like this as a key here, as a property name, and you will still be able to use it like this in your template. Vue automatically translates this so that you can use that dash header in your template, or in case you prefer it, the header like this. And then you can also write it as a self-closing element if you want to. This self-closing tag is not supported if you write it with a dash in between. Then this self-closing tag will not work. If you write it in this Pascal case, it works. So this is then up to you which style you prefer. I will stick to the header because that's the style I've been using before, but you could now also use this Pascal case style. When you register it like this, both is possible. And then you can shorten this even more. You can remove this key here and just pass the header like this, because there is a modern JavaScript syntax feature, which is supported in this project setup, where if you just provide a single value here in an object, this is automatically expanded to this syntax, so that simply key and value variable or value constant have the same name. So you can then just write the header, and this will register the header component under the header identifier, and you can then use that dash header like this, or as I explained before, use this Pascal case if you prefer that. That, if we save that, would also work. So this is how you can write your components and use your components, and this is local component registration. And of course, here in this demo application, the header is not the only component we can register locally. If we have a look, the user info is also a component we simply use here in our app template. The badge list would be another candidate. We also only use that here in our app.vue file. So we can actually grab the imports to user info and badge list from main.js and cut them there, and remove these global component registrations and only leave the base badge here, and then go to app.vue and add those imports here, and then add badge list and user info as local components in the components option here. And this code should still work because I didn't change those names here. Now, this components option is available in any config object, not just in app.vue. You could also register local components in one of your other components if you had local components that would belong there. But in this app, that's not the case. We're now left with the base badge component, which I'm still configuring globally. And this is a component I want to keep as a global component because I'm actually using it in multiple parts of this app. I'm using it in the badge list component and also in the user info component. And whenever you have a general purpose component, which you're using in a lot of different places, whenever that's the case, you typically want to use a global component. At least you want to consider it. Of course, you could also add it as a local component to multiple other components, if that makes more sense, but using a global component also often is correct in such cases. On the other hand, if you do have components which you only use in one other component, let's say, then you might want to consider registering them as local components simply to keep your main.js file short and to not register everything globally. With that, we got this working, but now we know global and local registration and when to use what.